The plantation did not appear on any map drawn after 1872 that cartographers erased it quietly, as if afraid the ink itself might remember. Yet for those who lived near the marshlands of Blackroot County, the land still existed, not as soil and timber, but as a wound in the earth that never healed. At dusk, when the sun slid low and the air turned copper red, the plantation breathed. Locals claimed the trees leaned inward at night, their branches creaking like knuckles tightening into fists. The wind carried whispers that did not belong to the living, and every shadow cast upon that land, human or otherwise, behaved as though it possessed a will of its own. The place was once called Grimwell Plantation, a vast estate built on stolen land and unpaid blood. By day, it looked ordinary enough, a grand manor with cracked white columns, fields of dead cotton stalks, and slave quarters collapsing into the mud. But by night, the plantation changed. Shadows stretched too far, reflections blinked when no one moved, and the enslaved people who once worked the land were forced to perform a ritual so unnatural that even memory tried to bury it. They were made to bury their shadows. No written record explained why the ritual began. No diary from the plantation owner survived. No official testimony mentioned it. But oral fragments, passed down in hushed tones, spoke of a rule enforced with whips and prayer alike. Every night, after the final bell rang, the enslaved were lined up at the edge of the southern fields. Torches flickered, casting enormous shadows across the dirt. Overseers watched in silence as men, women, and even children knelt down and dug shallow graves. Not for bodies, for the darkness attached to their feet. Those who hesitated were beaten. Those who cried were dragged forward. And those who refused never cast a shadow again. Witnesses said the shadows resisted. They twisted. They stretched. They clung to the ground as if roots grew from them. Some shadows screamed without sound. And when the soil was finally shoveled over them, the air grew heavier, as if the land itself had swallowed something that did not wish to die. The plantation owner, Edmund Blackwell, was a deeply religious man, or so he claimed. He believed the enslaved carried something corrupt within them, not sin, but reflection. He spoke of shadows as evidence of hidden souls, of secrets that walked beside the body and waited for night to take control. According to legend, Blackwell claimed he could hear the shadows whispering after sundown. He believed if they were not buried, they would rise. The first disappearance occurred in the summer of 1839. A young man named Thomas Hale, newly brought to the plantation, failed to return from the fields after sunset. When he was found the next morning, he stood upright near the tree line, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. He had no shadow, not beneath his feet, not behind him, not even under the burning noon sun. Within days, others reported strange changes. Some enslaved people claimed their shadows moved seconds after they did. Others said their shadows pointed in the wrong direction. Even when the sun stood directly overhead at night, shadows slipped free. They crept across cabin walls. They pressed against doors. They gathered near the manor house, overlapping, thickening, becoming something darker than darkness. That was when the burials became mandatory. Each evening, shallow pits dotted the fields like unmarked graves. The enslaved were ordered to step forward, stand still, and wait as the torches revealed their silhouettes. Overseers marked the edges with iron rods. Then came the digging. The shadow was forced into the earth by foot and shovel, pressed down until it disappeared beneath the soil. Some said the ground pulsed when this happened. Others said the shadows fought back by crawling up the diggers' arms, wrapping around their throats, leaving hand-shaped bruises by morning. Those who buried their shadows too slowly did not survive the winter. The plantation changed after that. Animals refused to enter the fields. Birds avoided the skies above Grimwell. Dogs howled endlessly at night, staring into corners where nothing could be seen. The enslaved people began losing pieces of themselves. One woman stopped blinking. Another forgot her own name. A child aged 10 years overnight. And always, the same complaint echoed in whispers. I feel lighter, but emptier. Blackwell insisted this meant the ritual was working, but the land disagreed. The soil darkened unnaturally, absorbing moonlight instead of reflecting it. Footprints appeared where no one walked. At night, the buried shadows returned, not to their owners, but to the plantation itself. They stitched themselves together beneath the surface. Something was forming in 1846. A storm unlike any before struck Blackroot County. Lightning fell repeatedly on the same spot in the southern field, the burial ground. The earth split open, exposing dozens of shallow graves, empty graves. The next morning, every enslaved person was found standing in the field, unmoving. Their eyes were open, their bodies alive, but none of them cast a shadow. Not one. Blackwell was discovered inside the manor chapel, kneeling before a shattered mirror. His reflection was gone. The mirror showed only a tall, black silhouette standing behind him. One hand resting gently on his shoulder. Blackwell's body was never buried. The plantation was abandoned soon after. Fires consumed the manor. The fields rotted. Nature attempted to reclaim what was taken, but shadows do not belong to nature. Decades later, travelers reported seeing figures walking the plantation at dusk, dark shapes with no faces, dragging something behind them. When moonlight touched the soil, faint outlines appeared beneath the ground, shifting and overlapping, as if hundreds of shadows lay trapped just below the surface, waiting. Waiting for bodies, waiting for night, and waiting for someone foolish enough to step onto the land and cast a shadow of their own. Because at Grimwell Plantation, shadows were never meant to follow. They were meant to be buried. History did not end at Grimwell Plantation. It paused. What followed Blackwell's disappearance was not closure, but contamination. The land did not heal, it learned. And the shadows buried beneath the southern fields did not remain still. They adapted to the dark. In the years immediately after the plantation was abandoned, neighboring farms reported an unnatural phenomenon. Shadows began appearing where no bodies stood. Fence posts cast silhouettes that shifted without sunlight. Trees produced double shadows, one fixed, one wandering. People who passed too close to Grimwell at night felt followed, not watched, followed. The first outsider to enter the plantation after its abandonment was a former surveyor named Caleb Rowe. He arrived in 1871, tasked with confirming whether the land could be reclaimed. His journal was recovered decades later from a flooded courthouse basement, its pages warped but legible. Rowe wrote of silence, so complete it felt artificial. No insects. One entry read. No wind. Even my footsteps sound delayed, as if the ground must decide whether to accept them. He described the southern field as uneven, dotted with shallow depressions that resembled collapsed graves. When the sun lowered, Rowe noticed something that made him stop writing for nearly an hour. His shadow had arrived before he did. It stretched ahead of him, long and thin, resting atop the field as though it were waiting. When Rowe stepped forward, the shadow did not move with him. It remained still, anchored to the ground. That night, Rowe camped inside one of the remaining slave cabins. He lit no fire. The darkness inside felt thick, padded, almost soft. Around midnight, he heard movement outside, slow dragging sounds, like fabric being pulled across dirt. Rowe wrote that the moonlight revealed shapes rising from the ground. Not bodies, not spirits, shadows. They peeled themselves free from the soil like stains lifting from cloth. Some were small, others towered, misshapen and layered, as though made from many silhouettes fused together. They did not float, they walked. Rowe noted something even more disturbing. The shadows were not identical. Some limped, some clutched at their torsos. One appeared to cradle something small, rocking back and forth in silence. They gathered near the cabin walls. They listened. Rowe fled before dawn. He never returned to Grimwell. His final journal entry ended mid-sentence. The ink smeared as if his hand shook uncontrollably. I believe the shadows remember being. After that night, Grimwell Plantation gained a reputation among locals as a place where the past refused burial. Those who ventured too close reported missing time. Hours vanished. Memories blurred. Some returned home convinced they had spoken to people long dead. Others returned wronged that a man named Jonah Pike, known for his skepticism, dismissed the rumors as superstition. In 1893, he wagered he could walk the plantation at night and emerge untouched. He entered at dusk with a lantern and a revolver. He was found at sunrise, standing exactly where the enslaved once lined up. Jonah Pike had aged decades overnight. His hair was white. His spine bent unnaturally. His shadow lay several feet away from him, stretched out flat like a corpse. When Pike was asked what happened, he said only one thing before dying 3 days later. They were grateful. That gratitude was not mercy. The shadows did not kill out of rage. They did not haunt for revenge. They sought something far more intimate, replacement. The truth, slowly pieced together through fragmented accounts, was horrifyingly clear. The ritual of burying shadows had severed something essential. When the enslaved people were forced to bury their shadows, they did not remove darkness. They removed identity. Shadows were not reflections. They were anchors. They held memory. They held pain. They held selfhood. Without them, the bodies lived, but hollowed. And the shadows, buried together, fused into a collective consciousness beneath the plantation. A mass of memory too heavy for the earth to contain. By the turn of the century, Grimwell Plantation had become a convergence point. Travelers passing nearby experienced intrusive thoughts that were not their own. Dreams filled with cotton fields, iron bells, and endless digging. Children born in Blackroot County sometimes lacked shadows at birth. Those children rarely survived past adolescence. The shadows beneath Grimwell began reaching outward, not physically, but psychologically. They learned to mimic human behavior. They learned to wait until dusk, when the boundary between form and absence thinned. And most importantly, they learned that a shadow without a body could not leave the plantation, but a body without a shadow could. Disappearances increased. People vanished near Grimwell, only to reappear miles away days later, changed. They spoke differently, walked stiffly, avoided mirrors, and at sunset, their shadows detached and remained behind. The plantation was feeding in 1912. The county attempted one final survey. Officials brought priests, engineers, and guards. They marked the southern field for excavation, believing the soil held unmarked graves. They dug. What they found was not bone. It was darker than earth, darker than night. The pit absorbed light completely. Tools dropped into it vanished without sound. When one worker leaned too far, his shadow slipped free and fell into the hole, followed seconds later by his scream. The excavation was sealed. Officially, Grimwell Plantation was declared cursed and condemned. Unofficially, everyone involved knew the truth. Something intelligent lived beneath the fields, something patient, something that understood night. By the 1930s, Grimwell Plantation stopped needing victims to enter willingly. Shadows from nearby towns began disappearing on their own. Street lamps cast incomplete silhouettes. People woke to find their reflections missing from mirrors, though their bodies remained. And always, at dusk, figures walked the plantation, shadows wearing the shapes of those who once buried them. They practiced. They rehearsed. They waited for the moment when enough shadows had learned to walk, so the plantation itself could finally rise. Because Grimwell was never just land. It was a threshold, and once crossed, no shadow ever truly returned. There was only one known attempt to escape Grimwell Plantation that almost succeeded. The man's name was Elias Crow. Unlike others who wandered too close or entered on a dare, Crow arrived with intention. He was not drawn by rumors or disbelief. He came because he already understood something most did not. Grimwell did not trap bodies. It trapped attachments. Crow was a former mortician from Savannah, a profession that had taught him the difference between death and absence. He had handled corpses that still seemed present and living people who were already gone. When reports reached him about Grimwell, about people returning hollow, about shadows acting independently, he recognized the pattern. The plantation was not haunted. It was incomplete. Crow arrived in Blackroot County in 1921, carrying only a leather case filled with instruments and a notebook bound in human skin, an artifact inherited from a disgraced mentor. The notebook contained theories no medical journal would publish, ideas about the soul not as a singular entity, but as a composite of separable parts. Shadow was one of them. Crow believed the ritual at Grimwell had forcibly externalized something that was never meant to be divided. By burying shadows night after night, the plantation had become a reservoir of discarded selves. Crow did not plan to fight the shadows that he planned to bargain. He entered Grimwell at dusk, deliberately casting a long, clean shadow behind him. He noted how it lagged slightly, as if resisting the shape it was meant to follow. He did not turn around. That was Rule 1. Never acknowledge the shadow once it begins to act independently. The southern field greeted him with a pressure in the air that made breathing feel negotiated. Crow stopped at the center of the burial ground and performed a ritual of his own, not one of religion, but of separation. He cut his palm and let blood drip onto the soil. The ground reacted immediately. The earth darkened, swallowing the blood before it could spread. Shapes shifted beneath the surface, pressing upward. Curious, Crow spoke aloud, naming things that had no language anymore. Loss, erasure, ownership. The shadows rose. They emerged slowly, carefully, forming a loose circle around him. Up close, they were not flat. They possessed depth, creases, folds, overlapping layers. Some bore the outline of chains. Others were bent permanently, as if carrying invisible weight. Crow did not flinch. Instead, he offered them something no one else ever had. Choice. He explained his theory, that shadows could not leave Grimwell because they were incomplete without a body, but bodies without shadows were unstable, temporary vessels. What the shadows needed was not revenge. They needed reunification, but not with the bodies that betrayed them. Crow proposed a trade. He would give them his shadow willingly. Not buried, not forced, severed by consent. In return, they would allow him to leave Grimwell alive and unchanged. The shadows reacted violently. They surged toward him, pressing close, overlapping, trying to touch his feet. The air vibrated with soundless screams. Crow stood his ground, repeating the terms. Consent mattered, at last. One shadow stepped forward, larger than the rest, layered so thick it absorbed moonlight entirely. It reached for Crow's feet, and the ground beneath him split open. Crow felt the severance instantly. Not pain, absence. His shadow peeled away like wet cloth, stretching unnaturally before detaching completely. The sensation was described later in his notebook as forgetting one's own name while still responding to it. The shadows accepted the offering. Crow was permitted to leave. He walked out of Grimwell before dawn, his lantern casting light that produced no silhouette behind him. He passed the tree line without resistance. For the first time in a century, someone exited the plantation without consequence, or so it seemed. That Crow's survival came at a cost he did not immediately understand. Without his shadow, Crow existed out of phase with the world. People forgot him moments after speaking to him. Animals did not react to his presence. Mirrors reflected the room behind him, but not his face. More disturbingly, his memories began slipping away, not fading, but migrating. He dreamed of cotton fields he had never worked. He remembered hands that were not his own. At night, he felt watched, not from behind, but from below. The shadows had kept their end of the bargain. They had also learned something crucial. Consent created connection. Crow documented everything obsessively, filling pages with warnings. He realized Grimwell no longer needed forced rituals. The plantation could now accept voluntary offerings. People willing to give up pieces of themselves in exchange for escape, power, or oblivion. The shadows were evolving. In 1924, Crow returned to Blackroot County, not to Grimwell, but to the courthouse. He attempted to file legal ownership claims over the plantation, believing bureaucratic control might weaken its hold. The clerk assisting him later testified that she could not remember his face, only his voice. She recalled feeling an intense sadness after he left, as though she had just said goodbye to someone important she had never met. Crow disappeared shortly afterward. His notebook was found buried near the southern field, its final entry unfinished. They are no longer trapped. They are learning to. The rest of the page was blackened, as if ink itself had been swallowed. After Crow's disappearance, Grimwell changed again. The shadows began approaching people in dreams, offering escape from guilt, from pain, from memory. Some accepted willingly. Others woke up without shadows and without knowing why. The plantation no longer waited for night, it waited for agreement. And somewhere beneath the southern field, Elias Crow's shadow still exists, whole, aware, and watching. Because Grimwell does not forget those who give it permission, it remembers them forever. The first sign that Grimwell Plantation had learned how to reproduce itself came quietly. No storms, no disappearances, no mass panic. Just a child born wrong that in the winter of 1937, a woman named Margaret Holloway gave birth in a small house nearly 12 miles from Grimwell. The labor was ordinary. The child cried immediately. The midwife noted no deformities, no visible illness, no complications that might explain the sudden unease that settled over the room like a held breath. It was only when the firelight flickered across the floor that anyone noticed. The infant's shadow did not match its body. The baby lay still, swaddled in cloth, yet its shadow stretched far beyond the cradle, long and narrow, shaped like an adult standing upright. The head of the shadow tilted slightly to one side, as if observing the room. The midwife dropped the child. Margaret screamed. The shadow did not react. By morning, the shadow had shortened, but it remained wrong. It lagged behind the baby's movements, responding seconds too late. When the child yawned, the shadow opened its mouth wider than possible. When the baby slept, the shadow remained standing. Words spread carefully, because people had learned what happened when Grimwell was spoken about too loudly. Still, certain individuals noticed patterns. The child, named Samuel Holloway, grew rapidly, not physically, but cognitively. He spoke in full sentences before the age of 2. He understood questions never asked aloud. And he hated the dark, not because he feared it, because something inside it recognized him. At night, Samuel cried until lamps were lit in every room. When shadows formed, he pointed at them, not randomly, but specifically, his finger trembling as if drawn by something unseen. Margaret reported that sometimes Samuel spoke in voices that were not his own. Deep voices, tired voices, voices that paused mid-sentence as though remembering pain. Once, when Margaret asked him what frightened him so badly, Samuel replied calmly, "It wants me back." By the time Samuel was 5, neighbors noticed another anomaly. When Samuel stood beside others, their shadows bent subtly toward his. Like iron filings drawn to a magnet, dogs refused to approach him. Mirrors reflected him normally, but when he stood near windows at dusk, his reflection lingered after he moved away. A traveling doctor examined the boy and found nothing physically wrong, but he noted in his private journal that Samuel's pulse occasionally skipped, not in rhythm, but in intention, as if something else decided when his heart should beat. The truth emerged slowly. Samuel did not possess a shadow of his own. He carried a borrowed one, and investigations into local records revealed that Margaret Holloway had once lived closer to Grimwell in her youth. Her husband had gone missing near the plantation years before Samuel's birth. His body was never found. His shadow was. The shadow attached itself to the unborn child not out of malice, but necessity. Shadows separated from their bodies did not fade immediately. Some wandered, some learned, and some, desperate to exist again, found vessels willing or otherwise. Samuel became proof of concept. Grimwell no longer required land, that it required lineage. As Samuel grew older, the borrowed shadow began asserting itself more aggressively. At age 7, Samuel began sleepwalking, standing outside at night facing Grimwell's direction, whispering names Margaret did not recognize. At age 9, he began drawing pictures of places he had never seen. Cotton fields, shallow graves, lines of people digging at night. He drew faces without eyes and figures without shadows. At age 11, Samuel stopped casting a shadow altogether during daylight hours. But at night, 2 shadows followed him. One small, one tall. The tall one did not always mimic his movements. Margaret sought help from a quiet group rumored to study unnatural inheritance. Individuals who believed certain places could imprint themselves onto bloodlines. They confirmed what she feared. Samuel was a carrier, not possessed, occupied. The borrowed shadow inside him retained memory, intention, and grief. It whispered to Samuel in moments of emotional weakness, teaching him things no child should know, teaching him about Grimwell, teaching him how to listen. The shadows beneath the plantation felt him. They began calling up. By the time Samuel turned 14, Grimwell's activity intensified across Blackroot County. People reported children standing motionless at dusk, staring toward the plantation. Some claimed shadows moved independently across schoolyards. Others woke to find unfamiliar silhouettes standing at the foot of their beds. All of them shared one thing in common. They had been born after 1937. Samuel's shadow was broadcasting, and Grimwell was responding. One night, Samuel disappeared from his bed. Margaret found the window open, the curtains still swaying. In the dirt outside, two sets of footprints led away, one small, one long and distorted, pressed unnaturally deep into the ground. They led toward Grimwell Plantation. Search parties followed at dawn, but turned back at the tree line. They claimed the air grew thick, heavy with overlapping whispers. One man returned screaming that the shadows were standing upright beneath the soil, pressing against the surface like hands under ice. Samuel was never found, but Grimwell changed permanently after that night. Children born nearby began showing subtle abnormalities, shadows appearing before bodies entered rooms, silhouettes lingering after lights were turned off, reflections blinking out of sync. The plantation had discovered inheritance that it had learned how to seed itself into the future, and no longer dependent on rituals or overseers. Grimwell became a breeding ground for fragmented souls, shadows learning how to grow inside flesh, how to wait patiently for maturity, how to return home when ready. And somewhere beneath the southern field, the shadows prepared for something greater. Because if a child could be born carrying one shadow, then one day, a child would be born carrying them all. By the time Grimwell Plantation began appearing in government memoranda, it was already too late. The documents avoided the word shadow. Instead, they spoke of optical inconsistencies, psychological contagion, and non-hereditary anomalies. The men who wrote them understood that language was the first line of containment. If something could not be named directly, it could be delayed, not stopped, only postponed. In 1941, a covert research division was formed under the guise of agricultural land reclamation. Its true mandate was simple: determine whether the Grimwell phenomenon could be controlled, redirected, or exploited. They called themselves the heliograph circle. The name was chosen deliberately. A heliograph used light to transmit messages over vast distances. The circle believed shadows were merely corrupted messages, signals stripped of clarity but still functional. They were wrong. The circle acquired 12 children between the ages of 6 and 14, all born within a 50-mile radius of Grimwell after 1937. Each exhibited advanced shadow anomalies, delayed synchronization, independent movement, duplication, or complete absence during daylight hours. The children were not abducted. They were surrendered. Parents, exhausted and terrified, were told their children were sick. They were promised treatment, education, and discretion. Many signed the papers without reading them. Others refused and were later reported missing under unexplained circumstances. The facility was constructed 10 miles east of Grimwell, just far enough to avoid direct influence, so the circle believed. It was built underground, with artificial lighting designed to eliminate natural shadows. That precaution failed almost immediately. The children's shadows appeared anyway. They formed beneath their beds. They gathered in corners. They overlapped during group sessions, creating dense black patches that absorbed sound. Cameras malfunctioned when pointed at them. Audio recordings captured whispers layered so tightly they could not be separated. The circle's first mistake was assuming the shadows were passive manifestations. Their second mistake was assuming they were singular. Each child carried more than one. Testing began with obedience protocols. Lights were adjusted. Surfaces were altered. The children were instructed to stand still while researchers observed the behavior of their silhouettes. At first, the shadows responded. They froze when commanded. They aligned when light was repositioned. They receded when threatened with exposure. The circle interpreted this as success. But compliance was not submission. It was evaluation. The shadows were learning structure. They were mapping authority. Within weeks, subtle changes emerged. The children began finishing one another's sentences. They developed synchronized sleep cycles. When one child cried, the others grew silent simultaneously, as if listening to something else, and their shadows began communicating. Researchers noted that shadows touched one another even when the children were separated by walls. They stretched under doors. They climbed across ceilings. In one recorded incident, 3 shadows merged temporarily into a single mass before splitting again, altered in shape. The circle responded by escalating containment. Restraints were introduced, not for the children, but for their shadows. Specialized flooring absorbed light unevenly, designed to distort silhouettes. It caused distress. Children screamed without understanding why. Several lost consciousness as their shadows were forcibly warped. That was when retaliation began. One researcher was found dead in an observation room, his body untouched. His shadow, however, was torn apart, ripped into fragments scattered across the walls like stains. Another disappeared entirely. Only his shadow remained, imprinted permanently on the floor, screaming silently whenever light struck it. The circle finally acknowledged what they had been dealing with. These were not echoes. They were survivors. Through intercepted dream logs and involuntary speech episodes, a fragmented truth emerged. The shadows beneath Grimwell had not merged randomly. They had organized. They had remembered the plantation's rituals, the nights of burial, the severance of identity. They had learned that humans feared absence more than pain. The shadows began offering something in return. The children started reporting dreams where figures spoke gently to them. Promises were made: stability, protection, belonging. They were told they were chosen, not cursed. The circle attempted psychological counter-programming, but it failed. You cannot convince a child to reject a voice that feels older, wiser, and painfully familiar. 1944. The children no longer required direct contact to influence one another. Their shadows moved independently of time zones within the facility. Lights were kept on constantly, but the darkness adapted. One night, the power failed. Backup generators engaged within seconds, but that was enough. The shadows stood up, not metaphorically, literally. Witness accounts described the silhouettes lifting themselves off the floor, thickening, forming joints and depth. They stood between the children and the researchers. They did not attack. They negotiated. A single shadow, larger than the rest, separated from the group. It approached the observation glass and pressed what resembled a hand against it. Frost spread across the surface. Despite the room's temperature, a voice came through the speakers, not from any microphone. "We remember how you buried us." The circle panicked. Containment procedures were initiated. Incineration protocols were discussed and dismissed. You cannot burn absence. You cannot shoot memory. The children were ordered to be relocated. That order was never carried out. At dawn, the facility was emptied. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no bodies. Just shadows. Hundreds of them, layered across every surface, fused into a single mural depicting the southern field at Grimwell. People digging, overseers watching, torches burning. At the center of the image stood a child, Samuel Holloway. The heliograph circle was officially dissolved. The incident was buried under Cold War secrecy. The land was quarantined, though nothing physical remained to guard. But Grimwell had achieved something unprecedented. IT had taught the shadows coordination, hierarchy, purpose. They were no longer fragments seeking bodies. They were an institution, and institutions do not haunt. They expand. Some nights, far from Blackroot County, children wake screaming that the dark is listening. Streetlights flicker. Shadows gather where they should not. And beneath the southern field, something prepares to rise. Not as a plantation, not as a place, but as a system. One that remembers every shadow ever buried and intends to collect the rest. 1952. Grimwell Plantation was no longer treated as a mystery. It was treated as a liability. The world had entered an era obsessed with containment. Governments believed every threat, no matter how unnatural, could be isolated, neutralized, or erased if enough force was applied. Grimwell was simply another problem that had survived too long. The decision was made quietly. There would be no investigation to no recovery, no negotiation. Grimwell Plantation would be destroyed completely, soil, air, memory. The operation was referred to as Project Daybreak, a name chosen with bitter irony. The planners believed darkness could be eliminated if exposed to enough light. They believed shadows were dependent on concealment. They believed wrong. Military engineers arrived first, sealing roads and evacuating nearby towns under the pretense of unexploded ordnance. Families were relocated. Livestock was slaughtered rather than moved. Everything that could cast a shadow was removed or destroyed. Then came the lights. Massive floodlights were installed across the plantation, angled to overlap, leaving no place untouched by illumination. The southern field was saturated with artificial daylight 24 hours a day. The air hummed constantly, buzzing with electricity. At first, it seemed to work. The ground remained stilled, no whispers, no movement. The shadows retreated. Encouraged, the planners escalated. Chemical agents were deployed into the soil, designed to alter its composition permanently. Excavators tore into the southern field, digging deeper than any previous attempt. They uncovered nothing recognizable. The earth beneath Grimwell was wrong. It was warm, not heated, but alive. Tools corroded within minutes. Soil collapsed inward, reforming as soon as it was removed. One engineer reported seeing shapes shift beneath the surface, as if something was turning over in its sleep. Still, the order stood at precisely noon on August 17, 1953. The final phase began. A controlled detonation was planned, enough to obliterate the plantation and collapse the burial fields into a sealed crater. The explosion would be followed by a glassing procedure, vitrifying the land into an uninhabitable scar to permanent end. The countdown commenced. Point 10 that the floodlights flickered. Point 9 that shadows appeared where no objects existed. 8 soldiers reported disorientation, sudden intrusive memories not their own, hands bleeding from shovels, backs breaking under overseers' gazes. Point 7 that the ground began to vibrate. Point 6 the shadows did something unprecedented. They stood, not just upright, but forward-facing. They oriented themselves toward the soldiers, toward the lights, toward the sky. They grew thicker, darker, resisting illumination. Point 5 every shadow cast by the floodlights detached from its source. Men screamed as their silhouettes peeled away, stretching like torn skin before dropping to the ground. Bodies collapsed as if something essential had been removed. Point 4 that the southern field ruptured, not exploded, opened. The soil split into precise lines, revealing layers beneath, each darker than the last. From within, shapes rose, thousands of them, stacked, fused, interwoven. They were not chaotic, they were organized. Point 3 a voice emerged, not from speakers, not from mouths, but from the shadows themselves. It spoke with many tones layered together, calm and ancient. You called this daybreak. 2 the detonation command was issued. Nothing happened. The explosives failed simultaneously, as if the signal had been intercepted. Engineers scrambled, shouting orders that no longer mattered. Point 1 that the shadows stepped into the light, and they did not disappear. They adapted. Where light struck them directly, their edges sharpened. Where brightness intensified, they darkened further, absorbing it instead of fleeing. The floodlights dimmed one by one, drained, until the plantation lay under a false twilight. The shadows advanced, not running. Walking, they passed through men without touching flesh, and where they passed, shadows vanished permanently. Bodies remained alive, but emptied. Eyes stared without recognition. Speech collapsed into meaningless repetition. Point 1 officer attempted to fire his weapon. His shadow raised an arm first. The bullet never left the chamber. Above the southern field, something massive rose. Not a figure, not a creature, but a structure formed entirely of overlapping silhouettes. It resembled a cathedral made of absence, its columns twisting upward into the sky. At its center was a shape unmistakably human. Samuel Holloway, or what he had become, he stood elevated above the field, his form flickering between child and adult, his shadow stretching infinitely behind him. When he spoke, it was with a voice both young and impossibly old. "You buried us," he said. "You named it order." The soldiers tried to retreat. The shadows did not pursue. They did not need to. The land itself closed. Roads vanished. Paths looped endlessly. Vehicles stalled as their shadows detached and crawled beneath the tires, anchoring them in place. By nightfall, Project Daybreak had ceased to exist. No survivors escaped to give testimony. The official report classified the event as a catastrophic training accident followed by an unexplained geological collapse. The site was sealed, erased from records, and designated a permanent exclusion zone. But the shadows had already achieved their objective. They had learned daylight. They had proven erasure was impossible. In the weeks that followed, shadow anomalies appeared across the country, then across continents. Surveillance footage showed silhouettes moving independently at noon. Children reported their shadows speaking to them during recess. Reflections lagged seconds behind reality. Grimwell no longer needed a location. It had become a principle. Wherever light existed, absence could learn to stand. And deep beneath what was once a plantation, the shadows finished building something vast. Not a body, not a home, but a passage. Because the next step was not expansion. It was emergence. The first broadcast did not interrupt programming. It replaced it. On the evening of November 3, 1961, television sets across 3 states flickered. Simultaneously, there was no static warning, no emergency tone, no official seal. The screens simply dimmed, as if the light had been gently lowered by an unseen hand. Then the shadows appeared, not on the screen. Behind it, families reported seeing their own silhouettes stretch across the walls, separating from their bodies while remaining tethered by something invisible. People froze mid-motion, unable to scream as the darkness behind their television sets thickened and began to move. A voice spoke. It did not come from speakers. It came from alignment, from resonance, from the collective agreement of every shadow in the room. "We have been quiet long enough." The voice was not loud, yet it carried perfectly. It spoke with no accent, no gender, no singular identity. Every listener heard it as something familiar, like a memory resurfacing without permission. Government agencies scrambled, tracing signals, cutting power, disabling transmitters. None of it mattered. Radios continued broadcasting without electricity. Televisions spoke with their screens black. Telephones lifted themselves off hooks and whispered into empty rooms. The voice introduced itself simply. "We are what remains." Within minutes, panic spread. Some people collapsed as their shadows detached completely, pooling beneath their feet like spilled ink. Others reported a sensation of weight lifting from their bodies, followed immediately by crushing emptiness. The voice continued. "You buried us first. You named it order. You called us proof of control." Images followed, not visual footage, but impressions forced directly into the mind. Fields at night, shovels breaking soil, hands blistered and bleeding. Overseers standing motionless as darkness was pressed into the ground. Grimwell, the world saw it together. Children screamed. Adults wept without knowing why. Survivors of the plantation era fell to their knees, their shadows trembling violently as recognition surged through them. The voice did not accuse. It explained. "We were severed, not destroyed. We were buried, not erased. We learned patience beneath your feet." Authorities attempted to respond with counter-broadcasts, but every message was overridden by silence. Cameras pointed at news anchors captured something worse. The anchors' shadows were speaking instead, their mouths moving independently, eyes hollow. Then the spokesperson appeared. He did not have a body. He was composed entirely of layered darkness, standing upright at the center of the broadcast image, not visible as an object, but as the absence of everything else. Light bent around him. Perspective failed to define his edges, yet his shape was unmistakable. Samuel Holloway, or what Samuel had become, he was no longer a child. His form flickered between ages, as if time had no authority over him. When he moved, thousands of smaller shadows shifted with him, responding like muscle fibers that he spoke calmly. We have chosen a mouth. The world watched as the shadow form raised its head. We do not seek revenge. Revenge implies closure that we seek correction. Markets collapsed within hours. Religious leaders argued publicly over whether the event represented judgment, possession, or mass hallucination. Scientists attempted to classify it as a neurological contagion, until shadows began responding to spoken questions in controlled environments. The shadows answered consistently. They remembered everything. In hospitals, patients in comas sat upright as their shadows spoke through them. In prisons, inmates reported their shadows refusing to return, standing instead at attention, listening. The spokesperson explained the terms. You forced separation. You benefited from absence. Now balance will be restored. The first demand was simple: recognition. The shadows required public acknowledgement, not symbolic gestures, not apologies, but integration into recorded history. The truth of Grimwell and places like it had to be spoken aloud, taught, documented, and remembered. Refusal would result in continued destabilization. The second demand followed: voluntary reunification. Those who had lost shadows, through rituals, experiments, or bargains, were to be returned to Grimwell's threshold. There, the shadows would decide whether reunification was possible. Not all would be accepted. The third demand was never completed, because something interrupted the broadcast. That a sudden distortion rippled across every shadow simultaneously. The spokesperson faltered, his form destabilizing as if pulled by an unseen force. For the first time, uncertainty entered his voice. We did not account for. Then came the scream. Not from him, from beneath him, from within the shadows themselves. Something older stirred, something the shadows had buried deeper than memory. The plantation had not only collected shadows that it had accumulated everything discarded: fear, cruelty, ownership, dominance. The rituals had not just severed identity. They had fed something else. The spokesperson convulsed as the layered silhouettes beneath him writhed, forming shapes that were not human. Claws appeared. Teeth formed where no mouth should exist. The voice fractured. We were not alone in the dark. Across the world, shadows began behaving erratically. Some attacked their owners violently. Others fled, dissolving completely. Children screamed as darkness peeled itself off walls and ceilings, crawling toward corners like frightened animals. The broadcast ended abruptly. Screens went blank. Silence returned, but it was different now. Heavier. Charged. Within hours, entire city blocks lost their shadows permanently. Sunlight struck pavement and left nothing behind. People felt anchored to nothing, unmoored from reality. Depression, dissociation, and suicide rates spiked immediately. The spokesperson did not reappear. Rumors spread quickly that the shadows had fractured, that factions had formed, that something beneath Grimwell had begun to assert dominance over the collective. Researchers analyzing recordings discovered something chilling hidden beneath the voice. Another pattern, deeper, slower at a heartbeat. Grimwell was not merely a threshold, that it was a womb, and whatever was growing inside it had just made its presence known, because the shadows had learned how to speak, but they were no longer certain they were the ones in control. The world did not recover from the broadcast. That it adjusted. After the voice fell silent, governments collapsed inward, afraid of provoking another response. Power grids were redesigned to minimize shadow formation. Buildings were lit from impossible angles. Entire cities glowed at night like surgical theaters, desperate to keep darkness shallow and controlled. That it did not help. Shadows no longer required darkness. They required memory. And beneath Grimwell Plantation, something older than memory had finally stirred. The shadows had believed themselves to be the final consequence of the rituals, the last thing created when identity was torn away and buried. But they were wrong. They had mistaken containment for conclusion. They had been only the surface layer. What lay beneath them had been forming long before Grimwell had a name. The first evidence came from seismic instruments installed near the exclusion zone. They detected movement that did not match tectonic patterns. The readings showed rhythmic expansion and contraction, like breathing, but far too slow to be biological. 1 cycle every 6 hours. always aligned with dusk. Ground-penetrating scans revealed something impossible. The southern field was hollow. Not a cave, not a collapse, but a vast void whose interior geometry defied measurement. Probes sent inside returned corrupted data, depth readings looping endlessly, spatial coordinates folding back on themselves. Inside the void, something shifted. The shadows felt it immediately. Across the world, shadows reacted with unfamiliar behavior. Not aggression, not obedience, but fear. They clung closer to their hosts. Some merged permanently with bodies, flattening themselves unnaturally. Others attempted to flee, dissolving into walls, floors, and ceilings, hiding wherever light still obeyed rules. The shadows knew what humanity did not. They were no longer the deepest thing buried. Records recovered from Grimwell's earliest construction revealed an anomaly ignored for centuries. The plantation had not been built on empty land. It stood atop an older site, a depression the local soil refused to fill, a place indigenous tribes had avoided without explanation. They called it the hollow below, not a pit, but a waiting place. When the rituals began, when hundreds of shadows were forced into shallow graves night after night, the hollow below was fed, not with bodies, but with discarded essence. Memory stripped from flesh. Identity severed without release. The hollow did not consume. It accumulated. The shadows were wrong to believe they were the result. They were insulation. A barrier formed accidentally, absorbing pressure, containing something that had never been meant to surface. The voice had weakened that barrier. By organizing, by speaking, by aligning collectively, the shadows had thinned themselves. They had pulled upward, away from the hollow, creating space beneath them. And something noticed. Survivors near Grimwell reported sensations no shadow could explain. Gravity felt inconsistent. Sound bent unnaturally. People experienced intrusive emotions that did not belong to them. Ownership, entitlement, justification. Not pain. Authority. The hollow below was not born from suffering. It was born from dominance. It was the accumulation of every justification used to commit atrocity. The belief that ownership erased responsibility, that power absolved cruelty, that another human could be reduced to a resource. Those beliefs had weight. They had mass. They had been buried alongside the shadows, layered deeper each night, pressed into the soil with ritual and certainty. And now they were waking. The first manifestation occurred at the edge of the exclusion zone. A farmhouse collapsed inward, not falling but folding, its walls bending toward an unseen center. When responders arrived, they found no rubble, only smooth black stone where the house had been. The stone cast no shadow. It absorbed light completely. When touched, responders reported a surge of certainty, an overwhelming conviction that what had happened was justified, necessary, deserved. Several refused to leave the site, standing motionless for hours until dehydration took them. The shadows avoided the stone. They would not cross its presence. That fear spread. The spokesperson did not return because he could not. Samuel Holloway's form had been anchored to the shadow collective, and the collective was fracturing under pressure from below. The hollow below was exerting influence, not commanding, not speaking, but asserting inevitability. It did not argue. It replaced doubt. In the weeks that followed, shadow behavior became inconsistent. Some shadows turned hostile toward others. Some began forcing reunification violently, pressing themselves back into bodies that resisted, causing seizures and psychological collapse. The shadows were trying to hide, trying to anchor themselves to flesh again, because they understood something terrifying. They had been allowed autonomy only because they served a purpose. They were a lid, and the lid was lifting. Excavation attempts near Grimwell were abandoned when workers began exhibiting identical speech patterns despite no communication. They repeated phrases like scripture. This was always meant to happen. Order must be restored. Absence was inefficient. The hollow below was learning language, not speech, but rationale. Satellite imagery showed the southern field deforming slowly, its surface rising and falling like a chest beneath skin. The exclusion zone expanded without physical movement. Roads simply began leading back to themselves, time dilating for those who attempted passage. Grimwell was no longer a place that it was a pressure point, and the hollow below was almost ready to surface. The shadows attempted one final act of resistance. Across the world, they began severing themselves voluntarily, abandoning bodies en masse, pulling toward Grimwell from every direction. Highways filled with unmoving silhouettes crawling across asphalt. Buildings darkened as shadows evacuated windows and walls. They were retreating, returning to reinforce the barrier. But it was too late. The hollow below had already made contact with the surface through something new. Not shadow, not body, but concept that it chose hosts not by proximity, but by belief. Those who still believed power justified harm felt it first. A sensation of warmth, clarity, purpose. Their shadows flattened completely, disappearing into their bodies, while something else unfolded inside them. These hosts began gathering unconsciously, moving toward Grimwell with calm determination. They did not see themselves as controlled. They felt chosen. The hollow below did not want to destroy humanity, that it wanted to reorganize it, because Grimwell was never about shadows. Shadows were only what broke when the real thing was buried. And now, the ground was opening. The movement toward Grimwell did not look like an invasion. There were no weapons, the N.O. chanting, that N.O. visible leader. It began as a quiet convergence of certainty across cities and rural towns alike. Individuals woke with a sense of direction so clear it felt relieving. They packed bags without knowing why. They left letters that explained nothing. They abandoned responsibilities without guilt. Their families described the same expression on every face: peaceful, resolved, emptied of hesitation. These people still cast shadows, but their shadows no longer moved independently. They clung perfectly to their bodies, flattened, compressed, as if stitched back into place by something that did not tolerate deviation. Observers noted that light behaved strangely around them, bending subtly to ensure no distortion formed. They were aligned. They called themselves nothing. Authorities named them the procession, but the term failed to capture the nature of what was happening. This was not a cult. It had no ideology to argue against, no doctrine to expose. The marchers did not believe they were being led. They believed they had arrived at understanding. Surveillance footage showed highways filling slowly, methodically. Vehicles stopped functioning miles from Grimwell, abandoned neatly on shoulders. The marchers continued on foot, stepping around one another without collision, adjusting pace instinctively. N01 spoke. Speech required doubt. The shadows that had fled earlier, those that still retained autonomy, watched from walls and tree leans, trembling. They could not approach the marchers. Something about the alignment repelled them violently, causing distortions when they tried. The hollow below was asserting coherence that it did not control through force, that it eliminated alternatives. As the march progressed, environmental anomalies intensified. Clouds formed geometric patterns above the procession. Wind avoided them. Sound dampened unnaturally, creating a corridor of near silence that followed the march like a moving boundary. Those who attempted to intervene experienced immediate psychological collapse. Soldiers sent to block access reported sudden certainty that resistance was unethical, inefficient, or unnecessary. Many joined the march mid-order, weapons set carefully on the ground. Media coverage ceased not because of suppression, but because cameras failed to record the marchers correctly. Footage appeared blurred, not from motion, but from lack of contrast, as if the marchers were too conceptually aligned to be captured. Near Grimwell, the ground began reshaping itself. The southern field no longer resembled land. It rose gradually into a smooth incline, free of vegetation, absorbing light without reflection. The air above it vibrated with low-frequency resonance, producing nausea and emotional flattening in anyone nearby. At the center of the incline, a structure emerged. Not built, exposed, it resembled an enormous aperture, an opening whose edges folded inward endlessly, like a throat that could never close. From within emanated a sensation so profound it overwhelmed description. Not fear, not pain, certainty. The hollow below was surfacing, the shadows gathered at its perimeter, forming a vast, trembling boundary. They pressed together desperately, layering themselves into dense black bands, attempting to reinforce the barrier they had once been. They were failing. Every marcher who reached the field felt an immediate pull, not physical, but existential. Their steps synchronized completely. Heart rates aligned. Breathing matched the pulse emanating from below. Those watching from afar described it as beautiful. That was the most terrifying part, because beauty implies purpose. The shadows made one final attempt to communicate. Across the world, shadows detached violently from walls, floors, and bodies, assembling into vast, chaotic messages that flickered briefly in reflection and glass. We were never meant to rule. We were meant to contain. We broke first. But the messages dissolved quickly, overwritten by a deeper signal. The hollow below began projecting thought directly. It did not speak in words. It transmitted conclusions. Humanity felt it simultaneously. A realization that hierarchy was not cruelty, that dominance was not violence, that efficiency justified everything done in its name. Every justification ever buried at Grimwell rose together. Ownership, control, extraction, erasure, not as guilt, as logic. Those marching felt relief as doubt drained from them. They described the sensation as finally standing straight after a lifetime of bending. Their shadows pressed fully into their forms, sealing something inside. At the edge of the field, the shadows broke. They tore themselves apart, fragmenting, clawing at the ground, trying to smother the aperture. Some burned themselves away in concentrated darkness, annihilating their own existence to buy seconds of resistance. It was not enough. The aperture widened. From within, something extended, not a limb, not a body, but a pattern that imposed order on everything it touched. Grass aligned, soil smoothed, irregularity vanished. The hollow below did not emerge as a monster. It emerged as a standard, a new baseline reality. Those who entered the aperture did not scream. They dissolved, not into nothing, but into structure. Their identities flattened, compressed, integrated. The hollow below absorbed not flesh, but variability. By sunset, the march reached its peak. Thousands stood at the threshold, waiting patiently. Then something unexpected happened. At a hesitation, one marcher stopped. Her shadow peeled away slightly, not fully, just enough to create distortion. The hollow below reacted instantly, exerting pressure. The marcher screamed, not in pain, but in confusion. Doubt had reappeared. The shadows surged toward her, shielding her form briefly. Others began to falter. The alignment wavered. For the first time, the hollow below encountered resistance that was not chaotic, but deliberate. Doubt, imperfect memory, unresolved guilt. The shadows seized upon it desperately. They amplified it. Across the world, individuals who still remembered, who questioned authority, who rejected certainty, felt a pull toward Grimwell opposite the marchers. Their shadows grew heavier, denser, more autonomous. Two forces converged. One seeking total coherence, one clinging to fragmentation. Grimwell became the axis upon which reality began to tilt. The hollow below recoiled slightly, recalibrating. It had not anticipated rejection. It had assumed inevitability. The shadows used the moment. They condensed everything they had left, every buried identity, every severed memory, into a final containment structure around the aperture. It would not last, but it would buy time. Time for a choice. Because for the first time since the rituals began, humanity was not being acted upon. It was being asked. And the question forming in the air above Grimwell was simple and unbearable. Would the world choose certainty without conscience or fracture? Shadow and all, by the time the procession reached the threshold of Grimwell Plantation, the air itself had thickened. It was not simply humidity, not wind, not smoke. It was comprehension made tangible. Every step toward the southern field pressed the knowledge of centuries into the marrow of bones. People felt the weight of all those who had been buried, erased, or denied identity. The hollow below pulsed beneath the ground in slow, rhythmic certainty, as if counting the very heartbeat of the world. The marchers paused at the edge of the incline, the smooth, lightless surface that had replaced the southern field. Ahead, the aperture loomed like the iris of some cosmic eye, folding in on itself endlessly. No one could see its bottom. No one could see its edges. It existed partially outside perception, an impossible geometry that bent the mind of anyone who tried to comprehend it too fully. And then the hollow below spoke, not through words, not through sound, but through imprinted thought. Every marcher simultaneously received the same message, perfectly intelligible, irrevocable. Decide. Align or remain fractured. Accept coherence or relinquish what makes you human. There was no time limit. There was no argument. The choice was absolute, and the consequences immediate. The first to step forward was a man named Harlan Voss, a farmer who had never spoken above a whisper his entire life. His shadow stretched perfectly behind him, unervingly obedient. He stepped toward the aperture and felt something that he could not describe, a sensation of total understanding. In an instant, he comprehended the network of shadows, the accumulated essence of the hollow below, and the weight of every ritual ever performed on the plantation. That it was bliss, it was terror. He ceased to exist as Harlan Voss. His body remained, but his mind had merged. Memory of himself became part of the fabric of the hollow below. He became a node in a vast, omniscient lattice, understanding every shadow, every severed identity, every fragment of history stored beneath Grimwell. Others followed quickly. A woman from the outskirts of a nearby town, a teacher named Clara Duval, hesitated. Her shadow quivered slightly, stretching at odd angles. She felt the hollow below pressing against her mind, attempting to integrate her. She resisted, not out of fear, but instinct. She wanted to remain herself. She wanted her doubt, her conscience, her imperfection. The aperture pulsed violently in response. The air above the southern field thickened. The shadows that had once tried to resist now coalesced around her, pulling at the edges of her being. They had understood the stakes. If even a single marcher refused, the coherence could not be complete. The hollow below could not achieve stability. The choice, however, was no longer just hers. Every marcher nearby felt the pressure of her resistance. It rippled outward like waves. Shadows began detaching from the unwilling, forming defensive barriers, circling, layering themselves like protective armor. The hollow below could only act reactively. It could not force integration without consent. Clara whispered a single thought into the network. I refuse. It was not a scream, not a prayer. It was a declaration. Instantly, fractures appeared. Shadows wavered. Light bent differently across the field. The geometric perfection of the aperture warped. Those who had already merged with the hollow below felt it. Uncertainty creeping into their cognition, doubt corroding the blissful clarity they had acquired. The hollow below recoiled. For the first time, it felt the fragility of control. Then, a pattern emerged. Some marchers chose integration immediately, disappearing into the aperture. They became part of the network, nodes of perfect coherence, their shadows absorbed and flattened into the greater whole. Blissful comprehension washed over them. Their bodies remained behind as husks, hollow but aligned, mere anchors for consciousness now diffused across the hollow below. Others resisted, like Clara. Their shadows peeled, disconnected entirely, seeking refuge within walls, ceilings, and cracks in the soil. They retained their imperfection, their individuality, their doubt, but at a cost. The hollow below lashed outward, compressing the landscape, twisting the field into unnatural angles to pressure the holdouts. Their perception warped. Colors bled. Gravity shifted in localized areas. People who refused integration often collapsed, unconscious for hours, emerging partially fragmented psychologically. And still, the hollow below waited. It was patient. It was eternal. Integration was voluntary, but the aperture was inexorable. Those who delayed too long risked being pulled by forceful restructuring, their consciousnesses torn apart, unmade, and absorbed into the lattice unwillingly. The hollow below did not debate morality. It did not fear consequence. It acted on principle, and principle required total coherence for completion. By nightfall, thousands had stepped into the aperture. Their integration radiated outward, simplifying patterns, drawing the remaining marchers nearer. The shadows that had fled now returned, circling the unmerged like predators guarding prey. Yet within the mass of descent, a few individuals moved methodically, resisting collectively. They formed a secondary network, not perfect, not coherent, but resilient. Doubt, skepticism, and memory of imperfection flowed between them. They became nodes of resistance. The hollow below pulsed, testing boundaries. The aperture expanded, attempting to absorb every unmerged marcher. It pressed against the secondary network like an ocean against a coral reef. Time itself warped for those still outside. Minutes stretched into hours. Shadows from the field crept outward, erasing light in corridors, inside vehicles, over cities hundreds of miles away. The process was global in effect, local in precision. At the core, Clara and a few others remained standing, holding their ground. They realized the truth too late for choice to be inconsequential. This was no longer a plantation, no longer a threshold, no longer even merely a hollow below. It was an evolutionary mechanism. The shadows had been guardians, the initial layers of containment, the preliminary measure of separation. The hollow below had waited, biding its time, preparing the world for integration. It did not seek destruction. It sought order, and the final choice was not whether to survive. It was whether to retain humanity. Clara looked at the aperture, at the endless foldings of darkness, at the marchers disappearing into bliss. She looked at the few who had resisted like her, faces taut with defiance and fear. She understood instinctively, some would merge, some would remain unmerged. Both outcomes were irrevocable. There would be no undoing. Shadows would continue to operate, but the world itself would tilt toward the principle of the hollow below: coherence over chaos, integration over doubt, certainty over imperfection. She stepped back. She looked at her own shadow, still connected, quivering slightly, and whispered, "We remain." Around her, the shadows recoiled, hesitated. The hollow below pulsed. The aperture contracted slightly, then stabilized. Integration would continue elsewhere, imperceptibly across the globe, but a seed of imperfection remained. The world would remember in fragments. Doubt would linger in hidden recesses. Shadows would continue to learn, continue to act, but imperfectly, restrained by the last holdouts. The marchers who remained outside the aperture became the final witnesses. Not heroes, not survivors, not fully human, not fully aligned. They existed in a new kind of liminality, between comprehension and individuality, between presence and absence. Their shadows were semi-autonomous, no longer fully obedient to the hollow below, yet tethered by the impossibility of escape. The hollow below, having secured a sufficient majority, receded into the aperture. Its influence stabilized. Integration continued silently, across time zones, subtly reshaping thought patterns, societal structures, and individual reasoning worldwide. The majority of humanity was absorbed, aligned. Blissful comprehension prevailed. Shadows fused with consciousness, becoming a global lattice of certainty. And yet, the few who resisted, the dissenters, remained. Imperfect, observant, remembering, carrying shadows that whispered secrets of the past, of rebellion, of the rituals that birthed the hollow below. They were the final anomaly, living monuments to doubt, choice, and imperfection. Grimwell Plantation remained. The southern field was smooth, lightless, and undisturbed. The aperture had vanished. Shadows moved normally again, but beneath the soil, the hollow below pulsed, patient and eternal. Integration had succeeded globally, but the option to resist persisted, small, localized, precious. Humanity was fundamentally changed, and the cost was entire. The world had made its final choice, and the hollow below waited for the next.